On Wednesday, May 8th, the Karen Read murder trial continued with more testimony in the prosecution's case in chief. In total, there were 7 witnesses called up on day 7. Now, a lot of this testimony repeated, and most of these witnesses actually seemed to benefit the defense more than the prosecution. However, the prosecution was not without its victories on day 7 because they did actually end up the day with some crucial evidence that they needed to get in front of the jury. Let's get into it. So like I said, a lot of this testimony started to feel a bit repetitive on day 7. Part of that was because we were hearing from spouses testifying to basically the same thing that the other spouse was testifying to, but with some minor differences in perspective. Now, when we have testimony that repeats, sometimes it's just repetitive and serves no purpose other than basically just to waste everyone's time. Other times, however, witnesses echoing the same things that other witnesses have been testifying to can be beneficial because it has a corroborating effect. This is particularly true when we're talking about a material issue that the two sides are really fighting about. For example, having multiple witnesses testify to Karen Read saying, I hit him, on the morning of January 29th is to some people good evidence that Karen Read did in fact say it. To others, of course, there is other evidence that contradicts that, but the point remains. And the same can be true of other material issues happening in this trial as well. And I think that on day 7, some of this repetition was helpful, but a lot of it did in fact feel unnecessary. So let's get into what these witnesses actually testified to. To start things off, the jury heard once again from Lieutenant Charles Ray. If you've been following along, you know that he began his testimony on day 6 and that at the end of the day, he had yet to finish his direct examination. I also noted in the day 6 recap that if the jury was able to pay attention at the end of the day, they would have noticed that the prosecution ended with a view of the back of Karen Read's SUV showing the broken rear taillight. But that is a big if as to the jury paying attention, because as I said in the day 6 recap, that was something that I myself had actually missed initially because my brain saw another police driving dash cam and thought, okay, this probably won't be important either. But I wondered if at the beginning of day 7, if the prosecution would highlight this to the jury to start out the day when their minds were fresh for attention. And sure enough, they made an attempt. The only problem was when Lieutenant Ray started to answer Adam Lally question about what he observed of Karen Read's car, he said that he initially didn't notice anything, but that on a second inspection of the video, he found something. At that point, the defense immediately objected and Judge Cannone sustained the objection. And so Lieutenant Ray was not allowed to testify about that taillight. The prosecution was forced to move on, so then they directed him instead through a bunch of security footage at John O'Keefe's home from when Lieutenant Ray did a wellness check on the kids. But overall, this testimony was pretty unremarkable, and when the direct examination was over, the defense stood up and said that they weren't even doing a cross-examination. Now, I've described this kind of a move as essentially a power move. The defense here is subtly communicating to the jury that they didn't really care about Lieutenant Ray's testimony, and none of it really drew any blood from the defense, and none of it really warrants any sort of a response from them. And to be honest, I agree. Okay, so the next witness of the day and the 17th witness for the prosecution so far was Michael Camerano. Both he and his wife, Katherine Camerano, testified on day 7, revealing that they were friends of John O'Keefe and friends of Karen Read through John. The witnesses said that they had previously been introduced to John by Carrie Roberts. And then they became close friends because John's niece was good friends with the daughter of the Cameranos. Now, Michael Camerano testified about meeting up with John and Karen at a bar called McCarthy's for a couple drinks on the evening of January 28th, 2022. And there was surveillance footage from inside the bar to go along with his testimony. Mr. Camerano testified that first it was just him and John, and then their friend Curt Roberts showed up. After that, he said that their friend Sully showed up, and finally Karen arrived at the bar. Now, the prosecution seemed to be most interested in getting testimony about what Karen Read was drinking at the bar. And they drew out of this witness that she was holding a glass cup with clear liquid in it. Mr. Camerano testified that he thought that it was drinking vodka, but he didn't really testify as to how he knew that to be the case. However, the defense also got out of Mr. Camerano that Karen and John were very affectionate and warm together that night at the bar. There didn't seem to be any sort of tension between them, and there was nothing in the air that suggested that literally anything was wrong. And the video surveillance footage helped to corroborate this. Eventually, Mr. Camerano testified that he needed to leave, so he ended up going home. The next morning, he said that he was awoken by Karen Reed calling his wife, saying that John never made it home. Then he testified that after he understood what had happened to John, he went to John's house to pick up Kaylee, John's niece, so that she could stay with the Cameranos for a bit. Now, this witness, along with basically all of the witnesses following this one on day 7, was a very sympathetic witness. He seemed like he was really grieving the loss of his friend, and he seemed, generally speaking, also very nervous. So cross-examination of a witness like this can be a little bit tricky because the attorney cross-examining the witness can end up having the whole examination sort of backfire if they go too hard in the paint. But here, the defense did well. Alan Jackson struck a good tone that wasn't derisive or incredulous like he sometimes has been with police officers while cross-examining, for example. And this shows a very good sense of when to use which tool with which witness. And he did get some important things out on cross. For example, the witness agreed with him that Karen had spent some time with John's niece and the witness's daughter. And the witness agreed that he had no problem with that because he liked Karen and he liked the way that she always was with the girls. He also agreed that the kind of arguments that Karen and John would get into weren't crazy. They weren't overly dramatic. They were over things like disagreements between them as to what was spoiling the kids and what wasn't. Apparently, John preferred a bit of a more conservative upbringing, financially speaking, for the kids, whereas Karen wanted to treat them a little bit more. And on January 20th, 2022, Mr. Camerano described their relationship as having a normal, caring, affectionate interaction, and he said that they never seemed like there was any sort of a hint that they would break up. So basically, unlike the prosecution's narrative in this case, this witness has testified that they did not seem like they were on the verge of breaking up. This is not great for the prosecution because they are the ones with the theory that Karen hit John with her car, partly out of some kind of final straw in their relationship. Anyway, next up was Katherine Camerano, Michael Camerano's wife. Like I said, there was a lot of overlap between their testimonies, but hers differs in that she wasn't at the bars on the night of January 20th, 2022 because she was working a shift as a nurse, as she often does on weekends. However, it was the next morning that her testimony was really more illustrative for the prosecution to tell the story of what happened. Specifically, she said that she was woken up by a phone call from Karen Reed, who was screaming into the phone, "Where's Mike? Where's Mike?" over and over again. She said that Karen noted that John hadn't come home, so it sounded like she was trying to figure out if they had linked back up at some point later in the night. And Mrs. Camerano testified that based on Karen's tone, she was so hysterical that Mrs. Camerano was actually really worried about her even driving. She tried calming her down, saying that he was probably on someone's couch somewhere to stay out of the snowstorm. But sadly, of course, that ended up not being correct, and around 6:30 a.m., Karen texted Katherine that John was dead and had been found in the snow. Now, like Michael Camerano, Katherine Camerano was a very sympathetic witness. In fact, the entire time that she was testifying, she appeared as if she was basically just trying to hold herself together and keep herself from crying on the stand. It's a bit heartbreaking because you get the sense that they really had a warm relationship with John, Karen, and the kids under John's care. But anyway, on to the next witness. So the Commonwealth's 19th witness was Curt Roberts. Throughout trial so far, we've heard a lot about Carrie Roberts and her presence at the scene where John O'Keefe's body was found on January 29th, 2022. Now, Curt Roberts is Carrie Roberts' husband. He testified that, like Michael Camerano, he was with John O'Keefe on the night of January 20th, 2022 at McCarthy's bar. He also testified that their friend Sully showed up at one point, and after that, Karen arrived. When she did, he said that she ordered a drink in a glass that had clear liquid in it. And like Mr. Camerano, Mr. Roberts testified that he thought it was vodka. So the prosecution is definitely trying to lay the groundwork to argue that Karen Reed had been drinking enough that night to be over the limit to safely drive her car. And so this is likely to be the basis of the DUI charge against her in this case. However, on cross-examination, the defense drew out of this witness that on January 28th, 2022, Karen didn't appear to be drunk in any way. She wasn't slurring her words, she wasn't swaying, she wasn't doing anything that suggested that she was actually impaired.
When you were face to face, you were looking at her and she was looking at you, correct?
Yes.
And there was some type of interchange between the two of you?
Maybe I was just saying bye. I don't recall. I don't
You
know.
probably don't remember the specifics of
No, I don't.
what the conversation was, but there appeared to be some type of small conversation.
I saw her from the video, yes.
While you were speaking to her, you had no indication that she was slurring her words in any way, correct?
I didn't think so, no.
No. Her eyes didn't appear to be bloodshot and glassy, correct?
Correct.
She wasn't swaying or stumbling in any way, correct?
Correct.
She didn't appear to be confused in her thinking or her speech.
She did not.
She appeared to be normal, correct?
Yes.
There was nothing about her demeanor or her interaction with you that would lead you to believe that she was under the influence of alcohol at that time.
No, not.
And also, like Mr. Camerano, Mr. Roberts testified that nothing seemed out of order between John and Karen. He said that he wasn't paying particular attention to them being warm or affectionate, but everything seemed normal.
And during the time that you spent with them at the bar, you didn't see any evidence of any problems between Karen and John O'Keefe?
I did not.
No arguments or bickering or anything like that?
No.
Neither one of them was complaining about the other, correct?
Correct.
And this again is not what the prosecution wants to see if a big part of their argument is that Karen and John were on the verge of breaking up. But anyway, at 10:15 p.m., Mr. Roberts left the bar to go home. The next morning, he testifies that he woke up when his wife, Carrie, received a 5 a.m. phone call from Karen Reed, who was screaming something. At that point, Carrie leapt out of bed, got dressed, and over her husband's objections due to the growing winter storm, went out with Karen to help her find John. Okay, so that's all for that witness. The next one was Rebecca Trayers, a bartender at Waterfall Bar and Grill. I was very interested to hear this testimony for a couple reasons. First, I wanted to know if we would see video surveillance footage through this witness showing John O'Keefe walking out of the bar with what the prosecution has described as a cocktail glass. That's because there was a broken cocktail glass found nearby his body at the scene when first responders arrived. And second, I wanted to hear what this witness would testify about serving Karen Reed drinks. Karen had said in interviews that she had like 1 or 2 drinks that night before driving John to 34 Fairview Road. But the prosecution has alleged that the number is actually much higher, something around 11 if I remember correctly. However, I was unfortunately sorely disappointed on both counts. Ms. Trayers merely testified that they basically serve particular kinds of glasses shapes for particular kinds of drinks. And so a shorter round glass is typically used for cocktails in this bar. Now, when she described this, obviously the prosecution was hinting at the cocktail glass that was found near John O'Keefe's body. But I also thought that the prosecution was also gearing up to describe the kind of glasses that Karen Reed was described by other witnesses as holding. And that's because we know that she was holding sort of a thinner, taller glass, but no one who testified that she was drinking vodka said anything about why they were able to tell the difference between that and, say, water. And so I thought that we would be going through some surveillance footage to show each time that Karen got a new drink and to show that the glass that she was holding somehow indicated that it was alcohol as opposed to something non-alcoholic and maybe a certain type of alcohol. But we got nothing from this witness on what kind of glass Karen Reed was holding throughout the night or the type of drink that she may have been drinking or any sort of indication of the connection between the two. And we got nothing from this witness as to the number of drinks that Karen had at the bar. So really, I kind of was confused as to the general purpose of this testimony and the fact that this gap was left behind. Anyway, next up was Nicholas Kolokithas. He's another social connection to John O'Keefe, and he and his wife, Karina, both testified on day 7 about seeing John and Karen at the Waterfall Bar and Grill. The Kolokithases were there apparently with a group to gather after their daughters played in a local high school basketball game. Also part of this group were Jennifer McCabe, Matt McCabe, Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, and Brian Higgins. The McCabes also apparently have a daughter on the same basketball team as the Kolokithases, and so it seems that the Alberts had joined in with watching their niece play that night, or at least in the gathering afterwards anyway. So anyway, Mr. Kolokithas testified that he saw John and Karen show up at the Waterfall Bar and Grill around 11 p.m., about 2 hours after he arrived. So timeline-wise, it sounds like they went to McCarthy's first, and then they went to Waterfall. The witness said that it was a fun atmosphere, and everyone seemed to be in a good mood. And this included John and Karen. He testified that John and Karen appeared to be a loving, affectionate, normal couple. He detected no toxicity from or between them at all.
When you socialized with Miss Reed and Mr. O'Keefe, did you ever see any sort of tension between the two of them?
Not at all.
Did they seem like a normal and loving couple?
Absolutely.
Did they seem like they were affectionate and normally affectionate with one another?
Absolutely.
Did you ever have any question about the nature of their relationship, any toxicity in the relationship, or any overt indicators that they weren't getting along?
Not to my knowledge, not at all.
Matter of fact, you spent more time with Mr. O'Keefe.
Yes.
Anybody else in the foursome, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, other than my wife. I mean, foursome.
That's a good catch. You're going to pay for that later. Fair enough.
I get brownie points for that, right?
Let me see if I can restate it a little bit better. Between Mr. O'Keefe and Miss Reed, you spent more time with Mr. O'Keefe.
Yes.
Fair enough.
In fact, he testified that they were so affectionate and warm and lovey-dovey that his wife Karina even made a comment to him, something like, "Why aren't you like that with me?"
There was nothing eventful at the bar, while you were at the bar with Mr. O'Keefe and Miss Reed, that comes to mind in terms of any kind of tension or fight that night?
Tension or fight? Absolutely not.
No argument that was audible to you?
Absolutely not.
You didn't see any body language between the two of them that would suggest an argument or a fight or tension?
In fact, I noticed the opposite.
Describe that.
They were affectionate toward each other, loving toward each other, and to the point where my wife even made a comment, why are you not like that with me?
You had something to live up to.
Yes. That's why I needed the brownie points earlier.
And to clarify, the way that he said it wasn't like there were any sort of like hard feelings about it between him and his wife. It came across more as like banter between a couple that's been solidly married for quite a few years. In fact, both of these witnesses came across as very warm and charming overall. They were very, very likable. But anyway, this comment was yet another one that seems to hurt the prosecution and help the defense. In fact, most of the witnesses for the day felt like they were defense witnesses because they provided basically nothing for the prosecution to move the needle in their favor. And in fact, they presented evidence that suggests the opposite of what the prosecution said in their opening statement about Karen and John being on the verge of breaking up. Anyway, a couple final points with this witness. At one point, the defense asked Mr. Kolokithas about his observations of some play fighting between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins that was captured on some surveillance footage at the end of the night. Now, this didn't hit as hard as some of the other evidence we've seen so far coming out on cross-examination, but it does seem that the defense is suggesting that at this point of the evening that some of the guys were starting to get into that sort of state of drunkenness where they start throwing their weight around. Maybe it starts in play fighting and then escalates into actual violence. It's not terribly uncommon when dudes start drinking together. If you have been to a place like 6th Street in Austin around 2 a.m., you may have seen some fights break out between guys that otherwise were friends. At least that's what I have seen anecdotally, having lived in Austin, Texas for a few years at a period of my life. But as the defense presented it, this is more of a suggestion of possibility rather than an indication that this did in fact happen. There's nothing here that was presented really indicating that violence in fact did follow from this play fighting. But the defense is definitely trying to put that thought into the juror's mind to have them think about at the very least, the possibility. Anyway, the prosecution also asked Mr. Kolokithas about the end of the night. Around midnight, the bar was closing, and so Mr. Kolokithas testified that the Alberts gave a general invitation to the group to come over and continue hanging out. The witness said that he and his wife weren't really interested, so instead they went home. When he went outside, he noticed a light dusting of snow at that point, barely anything on the ground at all. And as far as I see it, at least at this point in the trial, this is kind of a problem for the prosecution too. Remember that the prosecution seems somewhat obsessed with the fact that it was snowing during all of these events. And honestly, I don't know why they keep highlighting it, because everything we've heard suggests that the defense's timing of the events is more correct than the prosecution's because of all of this snow. Let me explain. So the prosecution claims that Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe in her car around 12:30 a.m. and then drove off to leave him to die in the snow. However, the defense claims that John died sometime after that, after going inside 34 Fairview Road. And in this case, the snowfall can actually serve potentially as a timekeeping function as to when John's body landed in the spot where he was found when first responders arrived on January 29th, 2022. Remember that a number of police officers testified that when they found him, he had about 6 inches of snow under him and not really that much snow over him. And at that point, it was actively snowing. Of course, there's the fact that there were some CPR attempts that were made on John's body, so that could account for why at least some snow may have been brushed off of his body. However, there is also testimony that the snow started around 10:30 or 11 p.m. and that at first it was pretty light and got heavier as the hours pressed on. And here we have testimony from Mr. Kolokithas that when he walked outside of the Waterfall Bar and Grill to go home just after midnight, there was barely any snow on the ground. So that leads to the question, what's the likelihood that a full 6 inches of snow fell in the next 20 to 30 minutes before Karen Read supposedly ran over John O'Keefe? Now, I know I'm a bit more of like a desert being, having been from Southern California and therefore less experienced with snow than others, but it seems to me that it would be a bit less likely that that much snow would fall in such a short period of time. Rather, it seems much more likely that John O'Keefe ended up where he was hours after midnight. Now, does that mean that the people inside 34 Fairview Road murdered John O'Keefe? No, not necessarily. There still are a few steps that would need to be laid out to logically get to that conclusion, and we still haven't seen that evidence at this early stage in the trial. However, it does introduce some skeptical thoughts of the prosecution's narrative of the events in question. Okay, so moving on to the final witness of the day, this was Karina Kolokithas. Like I said, she and Nicholas Kolokithas, her husband, were both very likable witnesses, and a lot of what they testified to was very similar. She also testified as to how Karen gushed that night about John, how much she admired him for taking care of his niece and nephew. And one thing that was different about Mrs. Kolokithas' testimony was that she also said that Karen made a statement about how she wished that John's family would also step up a bit more and help out with these kids. Essentially, it seemed like Karen felt like John had taken on the entire burden and others could have shared that burden a bit more but weren't helping enough. And now this was a small comment in her testimony and the witness added it almost as a throwaway. But it does reveal something new, at least in my opinion. To me, it reveals a potential point of tension that already existed between Karen and John's family over the care of these kids. And anyone who has either been married or had in-laws in their family knows that these kinds of tensions can develop between the sort of in-law and the rest of the family that they've married into or that they've joined into, whether the couple is dating or married. These tensions might be small and hopefully they resolve over time. Oftentimes they're a result of some sort of difference in perspective or upbringing or something like that. But sometimes they do fester into a much bigger problem where there ends up being some kind of overall rift or schism within the family. And while I don't want to jump to any sort of conclusions about John's brother and sister-in-law, especially over this kind of comment, one thing that does seem clear is that they are supporting the Commonwealth in this case. They both testified for the prosecution, and while they were testifying, they hinted at being pretty unhappy with Karen. And since then, they've been in court every day, seemingly staring daggers at her from just a couple feet away. And I never really talked about that all that much because I always figured that that was because they just thought that she murdered their brother and brother-in-law. And that could still be the case, to be honest. But it could also be the case that that belief could come from a place of disapproval or dislike for Karen due to this prior tension over the kids, if that actually did exist. Maybe. I'm presenting that as a possibility, not as a conclusion, but I did find it to be interesting. Anyway, here's where Karina Kolokithas' testimony actually ended up sticking a landing, so to speak, for the prosecution. Remember how earlier in this video, I said that I was waiting for the bartender's testimony to show us the surveillance footage of John O'Keefe leaving the Waterfall Bar and Grill? Well, we did actually finally see that footage on day 7, just that it was through Mrs. Kolokithas' testimony. And this is a crucial point for the prosecution. The mystery of that broken cocktail glass that was found nearby John O'Keefe needs some explanation for the basis as to where either side thinks that glass came from. The prosecution maintains that that came from the Waterfall Bar and Grill. And if in fact he was holding it when he ended up in the snow, that does seem to suggest that he did not, in fact, make it into 34 Fairview Road. And the thing is, I've always said I would love to see surveillance footage of him walking out of the door with it to show that he actually had it on him going into Karen's car. And here we are with that footage. And I will say that places some weight in the prosecution scale for their version of these events. That John got out of the car at 34 Fairview Road, cocktail glass in hand, and that Karen then backed up and ran over him. Now that said, there still are so many questions that need to be explained by the prosecution in order for them to adequately prove this case. That on its own is not enough to convict Karen Read. And that's especially true when considering all of the other evidence that has come out in this case earlier this week having to do with the evidence gathering. And the thing is, I have no idea why the prosecution waited this long to get this evidence in. In my opinion, all of the witnesses that were called on day 7 should have been called to testify on day 2. They provide the overall narrative for what happened on the night of January 28th, 2022, and on the morning of January 29th, 2022. And so with their testimony, we finally have a series of events to line up here. And that helps the jury to essentially file away the details that are being thrown at them with the other pieces of evidence. Once they have the narrative, it makes that a little bit easier. And as for the broken cocktail glass, that's something that the jury can finally look at and say, well, how does the defense explain this? Because even though the defense has no legal burden in this case, they do not have to prove anything or disprove anything. The jury is still likely to want the defense's theory to make sense if they're going to adopt it. So it'll be interesting to see where this cocktail glass ends up fitting in the grander picture between both sides. But as for now, prosecution finally has, in my opinion, 1 point on the board. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? What do you make of the presence of the cocktail glass at the end of the night? Does that move you towards the prosecution's arguments? And how do you square that with how you view the police investigation as we've seen it unfold so far? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more Karen Read trial coverage from gavel to gavel, both live streams every day and recaps every day, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next live stream or when the next recap is uploaded. See you in the next one.